Hey there, this is Joshua Lamata from Academic Advising at the Center for Academic Excellence. And today I'm going to go over some tips and tricks to help you prepare for exams. I'm going to go over a little bit of how the brain works when it comes to exams, as well as all the types of questions you tend to do on an exam, including multiple choice, short answer, and long answer questions. And while I go over all of that, I'm going to give you some practical tips and tricks for maximizing your brain's ability to study, as well as what's going on with all those different types of questions and how you can prepare yourself for them. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is talk about how we can understand the brain and hopefully give you a little bit of encouragement here. Many times we often think the brain is some sort of memory bank. It's really not. Instead, it's a very complex organism, and we like to say that it's plastic. And what I mean by that is you can kind of think of it as a little bit more like clay. It's moldable and it's shaped by the context we're in, the activities we engage in, and the types of thinking we use. And it's also a lot like a spider web. Almost all types of information that we learn and study, as well as all our thinking patterns and all the behaviors we engage in, all of that is interconnected in some way. And finally, my favorite analogy of the brain is it's a lot like a muscle. We can actually strengthen and discipline it to be able to serve us when it comes to our studies. So this is how we can view the way we study for our exams, is we're training our brains a bit here. And this is because your brain is highly adaptable. You're actually able to adjust your study methods in such a way to accommodate your brain's learning style, your preferences, and your needs. And with this said, doing well at academia is really not about your innate intelligence, but it's really more about how you conduct yourself and how much time you put into your studies. And if we have this perspective, this actually takes a lot of stress off of us because our grades become less about our personal characteristics and our value, and more about how well we trained our brain. If we didn't do well on an exam because our brain just couldn't recall a piece of information and maybe we bombed that exam, well, okay. It's not a remark on your value as a human being or your moral integrity. It's just more, maybe you got to train your brain a little bit more next time. It's just a matter of training here. So, with that perspective, here's a basic theory of how the brain works that it can be very helpful for understanding. Essentially, I have what we call information processing theory. For your psychology students, you'll eventually pick this up later in your program. But part of this theory starts with the idea that our brain encodes information into it. It processes it and stores it. The next part is how your brain retains that information. And then finally, there's the matter of retrieving that information back. So I'm going to go over these three things in more detail now and how they can help you understand how best to study. Okay, so I'm going to jump into encoding, but before I do, I'm going to play a little trick on you here. Did you notice that image behind me in the background at the start of this video? Do you recall what it was? Did you even notice it? I'm not trying to mess with you, and it's not really your fault if you don't remember, but if you're one of those people that do remember, it's probably because you derive some sense of meaning out of that picture. You either recognize something about it, or you had some interpretation, or you attributed something to it. And if you didn't remember that picture, it's either because it didn't mean anything to you, or you were too focused on something else, such as listening to me speak and interpreting the meaning of my words. And this is exactly how encoding works. Your brain encodes or registers information that matters to you. And the more meaningful a piece of information, the more deeply encoded it will be into your brain. So when it comes to studying techniques, what this means is avoid shallow studying techniques. Shallow techniques such as just simply reading material over and over or repeating the same words over and over. It's not really going to do you much good because it's not really engaging your brain. Instead, find ways to make the material meaningful to you. You can do this by visualizing or imagining what you're studying, relating a certain concept to another experience or memory you had, or relating it to another relevant concept that you're studying, or relating it to yourself. A good example of this would be, let's say you're studying biology and you're studying the heart or the different valves of the heart. Well, imagine where in your body those valves might be, or that part of your brain where that might be. That's how you can relate it to yourself. You're trying to find ways to make the material new to you, make it shocking, or even make it funny. Make an acronym or create an interesting story So whatever you do, just find a way to make it fascinating so you won't forget. If you want a good story from my undergrad back in the day, a friend of mine was studying one of the old prophets from the Old Testament named Jashobeam, and she couldn't remember this prophet's name or how to spell it. So I jokingly said, well, my name's Josh. So just imagine me sitting there with two laser guns going pew 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 as Jashobeam. And yeah, she was cracking up in the middle of the exam because she remembered it. She thought that was so hilarious that it actually worked. And yeah, she did well in that exam. Okay, so when it comes to retaining information in your brain basically consolidates information after it has been encoded. And what I mean by that is it finds ways to make the information more efficient so that you can better retrieve it later. And so if you want to retain information, it's all about that consolidation. And consolidation happens whenever you stop studying, whenever you take a break, have a nap, get a good rest at night, or just lay on the couch and be a vegetable for a few minutes. That is when your brain begins to consolidate the information it just learned. And this is exactly why cramming does not work. Because in cramming, you're trying to cram a ridiculous amount of information into your brain, and your brain doesn't get any time to take a breather and actually consolidate that information. And as a result, you're not really getting a good payoff. You're putting in all this work, but getting very little return for that. And now, the other thing you need to know about retention is when we encode information, we only actually retain the essence of what we study or the key components, the most important pieces of that information. What this means then is that when we study, we want to break those ideas down into simple pieces that are easy to remember. And this is where I like to use the parable of the mustard seed, because the mustard seed is just this really tiny seed, but when it grows into a relatively huge tree. And this is exactly what you want to do. You want to get the seeds of what it is you're studying because your brain is naturally able to grow it later. It's not gonna, your brain's not gonna encode the whole tree. Instead, it's gonna take the key words, the key essence of what you're studying, and then fill in the blanks. If you'd like an example of how to condense a concept down into just the seeds or key words that are central to that piece of information, here's what you can do here. So I have this definition here. It's the classic psychology theory from Freud. I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to go through ways that we can break this down a little bit. So to read the Oxford English Dictionary's definition for this theory, a therapeutic method originated by Sigmund Freud for treating mental disorders by investigating the interaction of conscious and unconscious elements in the patient's mind and bringing repressed fears and conflicts into the conscious mind, using techniques such as dream interpretation and free association. Your brain's not going to remember all this. It really not. So what we're going to do is we're just going to highlight the seeds or key words of this definition here. So I'm going to highlight just part of therapeutic here because this is a therapy. I don't care for the complicated version of the word. I want to think of therapy here. And then instead of highlighting all of Sigmund Freud's name, I just need Freud. We don't need his full name. We need the important pieces here. And then I'm going to continue. And I don't really need to talk about mental disorders. I know I'm talking about psychology already. I know I'm talking about a treatment. This is already assumed here. So I don't need all the information that I'm already able to figure out. So I'm going to skip those words. And instead, I'm going to jump right to conscious and unconscious. Because that is a very important feature of this definition here, of this theory. It's all about the conscious and unconsciousness. And then I can skip the next few words because, well, I don't need to talk about mind. I don't need to remember mind. I'm already talking about conscious and unconscious. I can probably figure that out later. And then we're going to highlight bringing up repressed. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, the important part of this theory is we're bringing out the repressed. And if you want, you can say fears and conflicts if you want to highlight that too. For me, I can already get an idea if there's something hidden in my mind and I'm trying to dig it out, what's hidden? It's probably some negative stuff that I don't like, such as fears and internal conflicts. And then I'm just going to leave it at that. These are 5 words that I would use to summarize this definition. So when I'm taking notes, I would literally just write a therapy by Freud about conscious, unconscious, bringing out the repressed. Done. You want to get more specific, you can put more specific techniques such as the dream interpretation and free association. But chances are, while I'm studying this, those are probably separate definitions. And I'm going to study these definitions in light of this theory. So I just don't need that right now. So when we're trying to improve our ability to retain information while we study, we want to write out our definitions or outlines in as few words as possible and in our own words, so long as we accurately capture our ideas. And the reason why I want to use our own words is because if we're using our own words, chances are we're able to have a deeper understanding of what it is we're studying. But if we're using someone else's words, we may not be thinking very deeply about what we're studying. Maybe very shallow processing there. So when it comes time to study, you can then write out the simplest form of a concept, a theory, an argument, event, or any piece of literature. You can write it all out in your own words from memory, from scratch, maybe on a blank piece of paper, or make a fill in the blank test yourself. And you're going to do this instead of repeatedly copying the same words out of a textbook. If you want another way to improve your attention, teach the material to someone else without reading it. Sit there, put your definitions aside, and try to recall from memory as you're teaching. And I'm going to go into a little bit of why that's very effective, and that's because it also improves our ability to retrieve that information. So when it comes to retrieving information, you can only retrieve it if it's accessible to you. And you can make information accessible by repeatedly retrieving it. And by constantly using and reusing that information, you're becoming accustomed to retrieving that information over and over again. And you're actually you are self-correcting your understanding as you pull it out next time. Because you sit there thinking, did I get it right? Yeah, I think I have that right. And then you correct yourself. Or maybe a friend or a peer will correct you as you're maybe incorrectly retrieving something. And so to improve your ability to retrieve information, it's all about putting yourself on the spot, trying to struggle to retrieve that information from blank when you have nothing, and also correcting yourself as you do retrieve it. And you can do this by creating your own tests. I highly recommend creating your own fill in the blank tests or blank lists of terms and definitions. Photocopy them after, and then keep filling out those photocopies. You can also use apps to generate tests for you. Quizlet is an amazing tool, especially for multiple choice. You can have it generate multiple choice tests as well as fill in the blank tests. Or, as I said, just create a blank list of terms and then just fill out the keywords of the definitions from memory. Or if you're writing an essay exam, write out the outline of your essay from memory. Have friends quiz you, as I said earlier. Teach that information to different people. And yeah, you can use cue cards and test yourself by guessing the definitions in your own words, mind you. These are just some of the things you can do. But again, improving your retrieval, it's all about that using of the information. The more you use it, the more practiced and prepared you're going to be for using it when you sit down in that exam room. And speaking of exams, let's go on to some of those exam questions you're going to have to do. Depending on your course, you're looking at doing multiple choice questions, short answer questions, and long answer questions. Let's break some of these down and what's actually going on behind these questions. So first up is the multiple choice questions. Basically, these are testing your knowledge of a wide range of concepts. They're testing you to make sure you know what a concept is and what it isn't. And the neat thing with these questions is a lot of times they rely on your gut instincts and your ability to immediately retrieve information and apply it to another piece of information. What this means then is that you actually want to pay special attention to those gut instincts of yours. Those feelings when something tells you that something may or may not be the answer. Because when we get those feelings or those instincts, it's possible that something may be triggered within you. Something is being recalled, even if you don't quite understand what that is. So pay attention, it might actually help you there. So when it comes to studying for multiple choice questions, you basically want to have the information so deeply ingrained within your brain that it's just a habit. It's just a natural instinct to recall that information. And to do that, that means you're going to have lots of practice using that information. And here's how you can do that. First, gather all the concepts you need to know. Often you'll find them in the glossaries of your textbook, either at the end of the chapter or the end of the book. Then find a way that you can begin testing yourself. It's all about that testing, because if you're doing a test, you may as well practice testing. Again, like I said, use apps like Quizlet to generate your own multiple choice tests. Create cue cards or create lists of terms that have blank spaces on them so you can fill the definition for them. And if you create those tests, highly recommend that you photocopy them so you don't have to keep writing them out over and over again. But if you use this fill in the blank approach, I highly recommend that you use keywords or short phrases that are necessary to help you remember. This will challenge you to think about these concepts and terms in new ways. Then, once you've done this, create a routine to repeatedly test yourself. This routine should involve testing, then taking breaks, followed by more testing. Do this over and over for several days. Do a round of testing early in the day, do another round later in the afternoon, and maybe one more at night. The earlier and the more you test yourself, the better. Your brain's just going to become a real pro at processing this information and retrieving it. And once you start testing, afterwards, correct yourself. Figure out which terms and definitions you got wrong. That self-correction is kind of like a red flag for your brain. Hey, I was wrong that first time. We got to make some adjustments here. That self-correction makes a huge difference. As you're doing these tests, procedurally start to cut out those terms and definitions that you just know by heart already. Save your time and focus your efforts on those terms and definitions that your brain is just not remembering for whatever reason. And then, as I've said before, repeat this all over and over again. Because your goal here is repetition. Not repetition of meaningless words, but repetition of you using information in a flexible and adaptive manner. Again, your goal is to put yourself in situations where you draw an absolute blank and you have nothing, so that you can then struggle to come up with an answer. Then compare that answer to the actual answer and see how you did. Over time, you'll find that you get more accurate as you do this, because your goal is to put yourself through a refining process where you get self-corrected or you get corrected by others so you can acquire a deeper understanding. You're basically putting yourself through boot camp by doing this. You're testing yourself, you're struggling, you're comparing your answers with the actual answers, and then you're repeating this over and over again. All right, on to short answers. If multiple choice questions are all about instinct, then short answer questions are where we're starting to think a little bit more deeper about things. Usually a short answer is anywhere between 4 to 10 sentences long. In other words, one paragraph. But this paragraph is usually focused on a single larger concept. Because if multiple choice questions are about a plethora of smaller concepts, short answer questions are testing you on a larger, more complex concept. And these questions usually come in two forms. First, there is what I like to call the umbrella question. These are those questions that are about a particular theory, argument, or philosophy that have components to them or sub-concepts. It's a concept with smaller concepts underneath them, like an umbrella. That information processing theory I gave you earlier, well, that's a good example of this. It's one big theory, but under it are 3 more smaller concepts of encoding, retaining, and retrieving. So to understand these bigger concepts, you got to understand the smaller concepts that are underneath them and how they relate to one another and make up that larger concept. And when it comes to actually answering these questions, it's quite easy. You just start by explaining what is this larger concept or theory. Then you start writing a sentence about the first component of that concept. Then you write another sentence about that second component, and then the third component, and then the fourth component, if so on, like however many there are. You just list them out in a paragraph. And then bam, you got your big concept in one neat paragraph. Now, the other type of short answer question is what I like to call the compare and contrast question. Usually in these questions, you'll just discuss 2 or 3 smaller concepts and how they relate to one another. And while you're working on these, what you want to do is identify what are these small concepts I'm being asked to talk about. For example, let's say you're being asked to talk about the differences between modernism and postmodernism. Well, when you write your paragraph, you're simply going to first explain what is modernism. Then you write a paragraph explaining what is postmodernism. Then you write a 3rd or 4th paragraph explaining the differences and similarities between the two. And so that's basically how they work. You write the foundations of what those few concepts are, and then you start talking about how they relate to one another. Then you wrap up your paragraph when you're done. So while you're getting ready to study for these questions, you're not necessarily going to know what these questions are before you even start the exam. So while you're looking through your professor's lectures or the textbook, pay attention to those concepts that seem fairly large and they got quite a few parts to them. Those are prime targets for a short answer question. Here are a few examples that you could easily write a short answer question on. Information processing theory, explain all the components. God's divine attributes, explain what the attributes are. The Kalam cosmological argument, what's step 1, 2, 3, and 4 of this argument, and so on. Or if you're asked to talk about a historical event, what were the significant people or moments of that event? Basically, you're trying to keep an eye out for anything that could be neatly wrapped up into a nice paragraph. But you also want to watch out for groups of smaller concepts that seem to have a way that they could be related. For example, if your textbook is listing out Arminianism and Calvinism on the same page, well, that could be a prime target for a short answer question. Plus, they're highly related to one another, just like postmodernism and modernism, or if you're talking about how humans develop through nature versus nurture. You just want to pay attention to those concepts that seem very obviously related to one another and that you need them together to understand them as a whole. Now, once you've identified these bigger concepts or these groups of smaller concepts, you want to study them together. Sure, you can study them by using the same methods you would use to study for multiple choice questions, but I would say don't shuffle these concepts around. You want to study these concepts together so that whenever you're studying about Arminianism, you're also studying about Calvinism. And whenever you're studying about postmodernism, you're also studying about modernism. There's no separation between these two. And I do highly recommend that you get your writing skills going if you're doing a handwritten exam. Or you could do a typing version if you're doing an online exam. Either way, again, create practice tests. As I have in this example here, you can write the terms on one side and then leave blanks so you can use keywords that capture what the definitions of these terms are. Now notice how I put a space between each one here, because I want to visually associate these pairs of concepts together so that whenever I think of one, I'm always thinking of the other. Trust me, spacing things like this can actually help you to associate them better together. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to create chunks of information in your mind. You're chunking big concepts and all their components together. Or you're just chunking similarly related concepts together so that whenever you think of any individual part of these concepts, you can't help but think about the others. Just like how you can't think about encoding without also thinking about retaining and retrieval. Okay, so on to long answer questions. These are the questions that students worry about the most. But long answer questions actually aren't too different from short answer questions. Instead of focusing on just one big concept like short answer questions do, or comparing a couple of smaller ones, these long answer questions focus on 2 or 3 larger concepts, or maybe just a huge concept like a big argument or theory that has many complex big components to them. As a result, often what this means is you're writing somewhere between 3 and 5 paragraphs just to answer these questions. Let's go over a few possible formats for these questions though, because these will help us to determine how to study for them. First up, there are those long answer questions that just want you to summarize a bunch of content. You'll do these often more in your first year, less so in later years. Basically, you just write a paragraph on one concept, paragraph on another concept, and a paragraph on a third concept. For example, maybe in your history exam, you might write a thesis on why World War II was a just war. And in your first paragraph, you'll explain some event or theme of the war that helps support the idea that it was just. Then you'll do another paragraph on another event or theme, and then a third paragraph on yet another event or theme. You're just summarizing a bunch of concepts together, but going into detail on each one of them in their own paragraphs. Then there are other long answer questions that want you to compare and contrast some different concepts. The typical format of these are basically summarize and describe this one thing in a single paragraph, then summarize and describe this other thing in yet another paragraph, then write 2 or 3 more paragraphs that just compare, contrast, and just relate the two concepts that you just summarized and described. Example of this might be, Well, maybe you'll do a paragraph on cognitive behavioral therapy, then a paragraph on narrative therapy. Then you might talk about the similarities of the two in a paragraph, followed by a paragraph on the differences between them. And the last type of long answer question I'm going to go over is the more analytical of the bunch. Basically, you spend a paragraph or two summarizing some argument, philosophy, theory, or event, and then you begin to discuss its strengths in one paragraph, its weaknesses in another paragraph, maybe how it can be improved or applied to some situation in a final paragraph. Basically, like some of the others, you lay the foundation and then you just unpack them. Now, these are just a few examples of the type of long answer questions you might answer, but my point is that you want to figure out what exactly you're doing in these questions. And ideally, you want to do this before you even start studying if you can. Sometimes your professors will actually give you the questions before your exam. Or maybe you don't know what the questions are and you're just starting the exam. You can still take some time to quickly do this. Just assess the questions, figure out what they're asking of you. Because when you get your exam questions, usually you can see that the question is asking you to talk about a few major concepts or components. For example, when you get a question such as this, was the story of Oedipus a tragedy? Explain why or why not. Because when you get a question like this, you really should know the story overall already. You should know specifically 2 or maybe 3 major plot points or themes of that story, so that once you look at this question, you can immediately begin thinking of 3 or 4 paragraphs you could write about, with 1 paragraph per plot point maybe. Here's an example. Maybe you start off with your first paragraph. Yes, it was a tragedy, and here's why. And then you spend a paragraph talking about 1 plot point, another paragraph talking about another plot point, maybe talking about a theme, and then you wrap up your essay. And so this is one of the benefits of understanding generally how are you going to format your essays, because when you sit down, it all starts to fall into place for you. So let's jump to how you can actually study for these types of questions. Let's start with those questions where you already know what the question is. Well, as I was saying, first, assess the question you're trying to answer. This will allow you to figure out how many paragraphs you're trying to write here and what the concept or goal of each paragraph is going to be. Because if you do that, then you get to create a rough outline of your essay. For example, here I have a mini outline that I'm just starting here. Well, let's say I want to write 4 paragraphs. First paragraph is just kind of introducing what I'm talking about. For the second paragraph, let's say I'm writing a psychology exam. Maybe I'll do a paragraph summarizing cognitive behavioral therapy. And then the third paragraph will be about Freud's theory. And then the last paragraph will be the similarities and differences between the two. And once you've figured out what your major goals are for each paragraph, now we want to start listing in a few points for each paragraph. And so I'm going to fill it out and expand this example here. Maybe I'm not going to put many points in my first paragraph because it's just an intro paragraph. I'm just summarizing what I'm going to go talk about. But in my second paragraph, I'll talk about the 3 components on them. And then for Freud's theory, I'll talk about 3 components there and I'll list them: id, ego, superego. And then my last paragraph on the similarities and differences, I start listing what I think about those. However, I'm not saying that you should write out your entire essay before you do your exam. You're more than welcome to if that's what works best for you. But again, our brains don't really remember all the words that we process. So I'd encourage you to create a very brief outline and maybe put a few keywords for each one, for like maybe id, ego, superego, for example. I'll list a few keywords of what those mean. And then what I would encourage you to do is go get a blank piece of paper and try to write out that outline from scratch. Maybe start by listing what the major paragraphs are. Forget their point. Don't even list their points yet. Just what are the paragraphs? Can you remember that? Then start filling in the subpoints of those paragraphs. And then this is where you can start to make things meaningful to yourself. While you're listing out those subpoints, start thinking of them or explaining them verbally or mentally to someone. Maybe come up with that vivid imagery while you're doing that. And then once you're done testing yourself by writing out this outline by scratch, compare it to your original. How did you do? And all your points for each paragraph, are they accurate? Then repeat this process again. Write out another outline on another blank piece of paper. Keep doing this until your outline is memorized. Because what you can do is once you sit down in the exam room, you can write out your outline on the side. Maybe on a spare piece of paper, maybe on the cover of the exam. and then use this as a guide for the rest of your essay. Because chances are, if you've been studying all these concepts as you're doing these outlines, you're going to be able to fill in the blanks of your outline. That way, when you're studying, you don't have to keep rewriting an entire exam over and over. Instead, you're studying the skeleton of that essay. Now, yes, it can be a lot trickier when you have no idea what the long answer question is. But in some ways, there's a lot less preparation for these, which is kind of nice. Instead of rewriting outlines for these kind of questions, the study techniques we're going to use are a lot similar to short answer questions. You're just going to begin by identifying the major concepts that you could most likely write a long answer about. Take a look through your textbooks and your professor's lectures. Pay attention to those concepts that they keep repeating or they've been going on about for a couple weeks. Chances are you're going to be writing on that. For example, in philosophy courses, you end up reviewing a very specific argument for a week or two. Chances are that's the exact same argument you're going to be talking about in your long answer question. And then in the social sciences and biblical studies, for example, chances are there's some major theories or doctrines you're going to be writing about. And then in history or English, you're probably going to be writing about those major themes or moments that occurred in a piece of literature or in a historical event. So identify those. They're actually quite obvious if you're paying attention to your professor. They may even just give it to you before exam time. Once you've identified those, go back to our method of answering short answer questions. Start chunking information together. What are groups of terms that you want to study together? Do some fill-in-the-blank tests for those. But again, you're not trying to memorize every single word of all that happens. You're remembering the seeds or the keywords of those terms, those concepts, those arguments, those philosophies. And then create a test for yourself. Maybe a fill-in-the-blank test like I showed you earlier. List the terms on one side, have some blank spaces for you to fill them out, and repeatedly do those. Because chances are those chunks of information that you've gathered together, you're going to be taking multiple chunks and just arraying them into a single long answer question. So for these long answer questions, when you have no idea what the question is, instead of studying an outline, what you're doing is you're studying the individual pieces to a puzzle. You're studying those components that you could just plug into your essay in the end. You're building your tool belt with all these different pieces, and you're coming to your exam ready to plug any which one of these into the essay, whichever the essay is going to ask you for it. And then after you plug them in, maybe you might be comparing them, contrasting them, talking about how they're similar, how they're different, how they're great, they have a lot of strengths, or maybe they could use some improvement. You'll be doing things just like that. Anyways, to wrap up, let's go all the way back to the beginning. So, you want to encode information, get it into your brain. And you can do that by making it meaningful to you and interesting. Find ways to build connection with what you're learning and to take pride in what you're learning. And then you also want to work on retaining that information by spacing out your studying over time and then breaking down the material into simpler forms for you to remember that are also your words. And then you want to improve your ability to retrieve that information by using it. Test yourself. Practice retrieving that information over and over again by testing yourself, putting yourself in situations where you're challenged to accurately retrieve it. And then for multiple choice questions, gather the concepts you're studying. Test yourself through multiple choice quizzes, fill in the blank tests, or randomized cue cards. Test yourself repeatedly. For short answer questions, identify those larger concepts that have components to them or similarly related concepts. Create chunks of information to study. Then create fill-in-the-blank tests for you to do. Keep doing those. And for those long answer questions where you know the question beforehand, assess the question. Identify the number of paragraphs you might write for it and what each of those paragraphs are going to be about. What's the goal and what is it going to talk about? Create a brief outline and then repeatedly write that outline out from memory, starting with the major points of that essay, followed by the supporting subpoints for every paragraph. And lastly, studying for those long answer questions where you have no idea what the question is yet. Look through your course content. Identify those major concepts that you can most likely write at least one paragraph on. Again, just like the short answer questions, create fill-in-the-blank tests for you to summarize those concepts in short phrases or keywords. And then during the exam, when you're looking at that question, identify what concepts it's asking you to write about. And then begin writing based on those memorized keywords. Maybe even create a very quick outline for your paragraphs, just listing the goals of what you're going to talk about in each paragraph. Anyways, this has been Joshua Matta from Academic Advising. I wish you luck in your exams when they come up. But remember, have a good rhythm in life. Find ways to break up your studies over time so that you can live in between those study sessions. And if you like some tips and tricks for spacing out your studies, I recommend you check out our YouTube channel. I have a series on there that goes into ways you can manage your time. I'll leave a link in the video description below. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.